Hi, and welcome to my very first podcast. I'm Susan Regan. I'm a relationship expert and coach, a certified mediator, a certified group leader, a seasoned marriage family therapist, and I have practices in both Boston and licensed in Massachusetts. And I am thinking that the main thing you need to know about me is my motto is I think relationships are everything. And one of the pillars of our life is whether we have healthy relationships. So I wanted to start off my very first podcast just talking about healthy relationships. So I'm imagining you want to have a healthy relationship if you're not already in one. And if you are in one, you probably want to just double check the boxes that it's healthy. And healthy relationships can extend to friends, family, coworkers, a relationship with yourself. So my podcasts are going to explore relationships in all different aspects. So our relationships, as we go into different chapters of our life, changes. And when we're in our 20s, we're having completely different relationships than when we are in our 30s and 40s, and our needs change. So it's really important to keep that in mind. We could be asking for lots of different things in relationships, and some of them have to do with our personality and our needs and what we want and what we like and what we're aiming for, what our career's like, what our life chapter is like. That will all extend and align into those periods of our life. But I think the one thing to keep in mind is that there's going to be some markers in all relationships. And relationships also, just aside, don't have to be traditional. We're finding more and more that traditional relationships have been kind of a setup for relationships, not to really succeed or not to have deep fulfillment. That doesn't mean that traditional relationships don't work for some people, but they don't work for everybody because it's based on sexuality and the way that you imagine your life goals to be, whether you want kids or marriage or a long-term relationship or more than one partner. So lots of things change, and lots of things are priorities in relationships. But one of the things, key characteristics is the relationship adaptable? Are you and your partner or whoever you're interacting with, do you guys have the ability to change and grow and adapt to situations? One thing I find when I'm working with my couples is the biggest sort of, I would say, obstacle in relationships is stress. And sometimes I ask my couples this question: how much stress can your relationship take? And there's sometimes in our life when our relationships are really fragile and they can't take much. And we really have to treat it as its own entity and how much we have to feed it. And so the entity is made from both personalities and both people, but it is its own thing. It's its own special sort of island, but it needs to be fed. And sometimes it just can't take so much. So I really want you to think about right now some of the areas in your life where your relationships are really, really strong, and you don't have to do a lot of work in them. They just naturally are healthy, naturally feel good. And other relationships that you have that you're always like worrying or wondering or feeling like you have to like check things out, and just question, why is that happening? Is that a personality thing? Is that a stress thing? Is that there's some kind of different stages of life going on so that you're seeing things very differently than that other person? So here's a few things to just start thinking about as I'm talking and doing this podcast. What do you relate to here? Another critical thing is communication, open communication. Can you talk about everything? Can you talk about successes, failures, everything in between, anything that's difficult, intimacy, sex, money, relationships that you have with friends and in-laws, and differences, and how do you negotiate individual time? A lot of couples come to me and they really want to work on communication, and I have to actually get in there and experience how they talk to each other and observe it, because there's so many small just idiosyncrasies that show up in people's communication styles. And so I really like to look at them. And there's also the feeling of maybe not being interested or being condescending or talking too much or talking too little. Like all of those things have big impact. So I really want you to think about your communication. How is your communication in a relationship, in the relationships that you're working on or that are important to you? How do you feel like you're showing up in terms of talking? And communication is also listening and asking questions and being interested and bidding interest. Communication is also about not having a huge opinion about differences and judgment. So people are allowed to have differences of opinions, right? So how do you listen to differences of opinions? And maybe there's sometimes in relationships, some topics that aren't like the most welcome topics because they're the topics of conflict, like politics, for example, or things that have been talked about too much. Um, and so to note that, what are the taboo topics in your relationship? And they might be taboo because they're kind of like peace, keeping the peace topics. Other ones might be difficult to talk about, but they're most necessary to talk about. But difference of opinions are allowed, right? They're allowed. And that is a part of good communication. Trust. Yes, trust is a big thing. And it's beyond just lying and cheating. Trust is about safety and integrity and feeling like the person has as much respect or as much ability to tend to you as you have to them. So there's a deeper level of connection. Like you could count on that person and you can actually tell them your deepest, darkest and feel like, you won't be judged or they won't turn away from you. So trust is a huge part of a relationship. And so sometimes couples struggle because trust gets broken, and trust can be broken in all different ways, sometimes unintentionally to protect someone, like especially in a financial matter. But it's really important when trust has been broken that it's rebuilt and that you actually strategize about the rebuilding. So I'm giving you some pros and cons, how important trust is. And if it's been broken, how important it is to build it back into the relationship. And then there's the whole part of like, can you be your own person in this relationship? So there's kind of a merging that happens in relationship naturally, and that's how you get close. But can you stay separate? So there's a term called codependency. And lots of people are like, there's going to be some codependency in the relationship because there is a reason why you're getting together and there's a dependency, like you're depending on this person to be with you or to be in some kind of relationship with you or relating to you in a certain way. But interdependence is a word I like a lot more. I know a couple who actually had a perfect model of independence, I thought. And I knew them a lot behind the scenes too. So I think it really held up. They had different life, different work, different friends, and they often had their really solid set of friends outside the relationship. And then they had some overlap with other people with each other. And then they had a very strong independent relationship, just them and interests that they did on a regular basis. But I really admired how much independence they both had and how strong their relationship was because of this. So interdependence, that there isn't an enabling of the other person, but people can be their own person and they understand kind of the limitations of how much independence they can have in their relationship. And that is also really, really based on personalities, because some people like to be closer than others. And that's sort of a natural thing, like how much alone time each person might require. Interdependence instead of codependence. I love the thought of curiosity in relationships. And curiosity to me means that both people are allowed to be curious in the outside world, in the external world, not the internal world that they might create. But that curiosity actually helps the people in the relationship to grow and change and evolve. And this curiosity also leads to conversations about what's needed for that person to be happy. A lot of people feel like, and we know this is a fallacy, right? Is that you can actually get all your needs met by one person, that your relationship can be everything, the biggest part of your life. I very, very, very rarely work with couples who live, work, and socialize together. So there's rarely a couple who works together and also lives together in the same household. Rarely. And I think it's because I think most people need a little bit more separation and a little bit more of their own identity. And it's hard to play different roles in each other's lives. It's easier to have like some overlap time where it's really conscious and intentional overlap time, and other times where you're actually having your own identity outside of the relationship. For some personalities, that's what needs to happen. And for other personalities, they might be able to have a little bit more closeness, and might be able to share a few more roles. I notice this a lot when people have kids, is that um, in our current society where both people, most people work, there is a lot of sharing different roles, and that can get quite complicated because you have to talk a lot. The more traditional the relationship, the less you have to really negotiate things. So it's a little bit easier. You kind of know what you're supposed to do. But in the relationships that are trying to change and grow, then there needs to be more conversation about what each party wants, so their desires can be met, right? Um, so that's sort of what I'm talking about, and I really want you to think about that in your own relationship. How much overlap do you have with your partner, and how much curiosity takes you out of the relationship and makes the relationship still work? So there might be this, you get along as well as much as you have your own space. And if you don't have that much space, you might not get along as well. So just watch that measure of distance. How much distance do you keep in a relationship that keeps the relationship healthy and the communication happening? When I see couples in a couple therapy context, I ask them a question about what attracted them to each other. This is one of the questions I ask when people are wanting to work on their relationship. And usually, when people answer that question, not all the time, but usually I hear this lighthearted, playful response about what initially attracted them to the other person. And it's a really good way to start the conversation, because we're remembering like when it all was new and when it all was lighthearted and fun. And one of the indicators when things get really rigid in a relationship and there isn't that lightheartedness, joking, playing around kind of energy within a couple, things are really taut. I hone into things like the tit for tat, conflictual style, because I know things that there may be a lot of resentment that has built up, and the rigidity of the relationship is there for reason to talk about what that is. So something to note is if you stop laughing with someone, playing around with someone, being able to have lighthearted conversations, then this is a real indicator that there's some work to do. Healthy relationships, though, can use this as a cue, like we need to spend some time together. We're working too hard. We're working too hard outside the house. We're working too hard in the house, and people aren't getting enough downtime. So use it as an indicator. Go back, just like with curiosity, into the relationship. What needs to happen to help people feel lighthearted again and playful? I always think the hardest thing to talk about is sex and intimacy. It's easier, even though it's really difficult as well, to talk about money. Um, but physical intimacy is really important in a relationship, not sexual intimacy as much, because as people have different chapters or health issues, sometimes sexual intimacy can be put on the back burner. But physical intimacy, the proximity that you keep with somebody, being able to reach out and hold their hand, that kind of thing is really important, because as human beings, one of our basic needs is being touched. And so if we're not being touched in our intimate relationship, that's going to be problematic. And we also might not be touching each other for a reason. Maybe we don't find the other person attractive anymore. Maybe they don't find themselves attractive anymore. Maybe people have stopped taking care of themselves. So this is another indicator. And what it's bumping into is, can you talk about the changes that you're seeing in your relationship? If they're bringing you into a place where there's no physical intimacy, can you talk about it? And can you strategize how you're going to work with your partner to have these conversations and find solutions? A strong relationship can also feel like that the party has become a team, like they have each other's back. And so even with physical and sexual intimacy, that it can be looked at if there needs to be a change or somebody's not getting their needs met or someone's not happy. This is talked about instead of it feels like pressure or rejection or anger or frustration. Like all of this can be open dialogue, right? So there's a teamwork approach. Like, how are we going to solve this? We can solve this. We have the skill set to solve this. We want to solve this. We don't want either person to feel bad, right? So we have to be really, really clear about all these things in relationships to get closer. Because if you think about it, all these things are developmentals, right? You can learn this. You can actually get good at this, this communication style and this asking for what you want and pointing out what you think is not working and strategizing how to make it work. All of this is developmental, and it's so exciting to be in a deep connection with somebody and to actually work on that as a common goal. Conflict resolution is another important key. Conflict has to be resolved. One of the areas that I think I see as the most difficult is when people avoid conflict. And instead, what they do is placate, or they just stop talking, or they keep their unhappiness a secret. That can build up over years. And I see that a lot when people's relationships don't work out, is they didn't talk about their unhappiness a long, long time ago. So the other person just assumed everything was fine. And they were really shocked when they found out that it wasn't. So if you're unhappy and there's conflict and you haven't been able to talk about the things that are really bothering you, and the conflict either becomes hidden or open, we really want to work on how to make conflict have a solution, because there is actually a solution to every problem. And sometimes the problem might be that we're just agreeing to disagree, but we're not fighting about it. So I hope that makes sense to you. Conflict resolution is also a developmental skill. You can resolve conflict. So I think I've mentioned 8 points of a healthy relationship, or at least a bunch that you can kind of um, tease out here. But one of the things that I want to start talking about in contradiction to healthy relationships is unhealthy relationships. And one of the biggest indicators is that someone is trying to change another person or control another person. And where did this come from, right? This is not anything that's just innate to a person. It's a learned behavior, seeing, observing your models of relationships. So I often ask my couples, like, who are your model of relationships? It could be like a TV show, or there could be sort of elements in the people around you, in their relationships, or in your family's relationships, partnerships, that you're like, I like that element. That was a real healthy element. I use an example of an interdependent relationship that I know about. And it's really good to see and to point out and to remember the relationships or the couples that you're hanging out with, that you see have real strong characteristics of a good relationship. It's good to see how they deal with it, how they deal with life. I remember going to a program a long time ago. I think it was called A Rescue, and it was kind of a Christian-based program, but I was experimenting with places that I could send my couple relationships to do a retreat. And this was a Christian-based program, but what was great about it was that everyone there was in a long-term relationship, and everyone really understood that it's hard to be in a long-term relationship and to have a commitment and to work out life with a partner. And so there was a lot of empathy in the group about the struggles of this. And one of the exercises that I learned, and I passed this on to my couples for years, was dialoguing, which meant that there would be a question. You could get it, and I'll put a link below to this so that you can use this tool if you'd like. You get sort of a list of questions sent to you every day, and you pick one to do, and you agree on it. This is the question today, and each person writes a page of notes about the question. And send it to the other person. So you could just handwrite it and send it, or you could send it on your computer or your phone in notes. But you write your own answer to the question. And sometimes it might be information about you that your partner doesn't know. What's so interesting to me is that sometimes when we're living life with someone, we don't know a whole lot about them every single day, about their thoughts, about what they do, about maybe challenges that they had, because life is busy, right? And we have our partnerships for certain parts of the day. We're not with them 24/7 usually. And so this is a really great way to just have a whole other dialogue going on with your partner that doesn't have to do with daily life. That increases intimacy a lot, and the ability to have couple tools that you use to practice having healthy relationship elements is really important. So what do you do as a couple together to connect at the end of the day, to wake up together, to spend time together, rituals that you might have, instead of just always being occupied or on social media or on watching a series or something like that? How do you actually interact, and what is some of your regular rituals that brings you back to center? My couple ritual section goes into the other thought of spending enough time together, and actually like this bleeding into that. So couple rituals, are you spending enough time together on the regular? Do you prioritize the relationship, or does the relationship get put on the back burner and never get any attention in any time? This happens in the child rearing years where children take precedence, but it's really important to try to have those couple practices, those daily couple practices, so that you can actually have the relationship solidify, and also have some capacity that you're building into the relationship on the constantly and consistently. And then we have the element of boundaries, of having good relationship boundaries. And what does that exactly mean? Well, it could mean lots of things. It could mean, again, the kind of privacy that you're allowed to have in the relationship. What's yours, what's your own time, what's your own thoughts? Do you write in a journal? That kind of boundaries. It could also be boundaries to the space that you occupy. Um, do you are people allowed to come into your space because your partner likes to be really social, or is there boundaries that are created so that you get to decide that together? Or that I know in a past relationship that I was in, I am not a hugely spontaneous person in my home. I don't like people just coming into my home sort of uninvited or unannounced. And my partner at the time was very spontaneous. The door was always open, so people could come in and out. And that was difficult for us because I needed my own sort of personal and private time. And then I had times where I could be social, but I couldn't be social all the time. So it was sort of that introvert extrovert difference. So that's something to think about. Boundaries. Boundaries can also be about what you talk about your relationship with other people. It could also be how you hold the relationship sacred around friends and an extended family. And boundaries around like prioritizing the relationship, like on date night. So if you're on date night or you're out in the community, that you don't interact with other people on at that time, that you hold a boundary around the relationship so that you can have space with your partner and the whole neighborhood's not invited on that date. So boundaries can be really important. I want you to think about some of the ways that you feel like boundaries are upheld well in your relationship, and some places where you think there might be some weakness, and who's doing that, and what's the boundary difference between you and your partner. And you might want to be able to look at that a little bit and think about, do we have to negotiate how we hold boundaries a little bit better if we're not matching there? Sometimes there's a thing that's called inequities in a relationship where things seem unequal. And one of the main problems that I see coming up with partners is that somebody has an unequal balance in how much they accomplish, like in the home, domestic tasks. And that really is a stickler. And so sometimes aside from having different roles. Sometimes one of us is better than something, some kind of task than another person. Finances versus gardening or cooking or cleaning or organizing or social life. And so that's going to happen, right? Because we're not the same person. But and human beings love difference. So we sometimes marry, or we are close to, or have friendships or deep relationships that are opposites. So we really have to negotiate not only how time is spent, but if we are starting to feel like things are always on us, we have to ask ourselves the question, are we putting it on us because we're really good at that particular thing, like cooking, for example, easy one to talk about? Or are we assuming that role? Or do we have to actually say out loud, it feels unfair and unequal, so that we can change it? Something to think about, to really look at when the inequality is coming up. And inequality could be someone makes more money, someone has more friends, um, someone has more hours at work, someone has more downtime. All of those things can feel like unequal, and they have to be talked about instead of building resentment coming up. And just to reiterate again, that it's so important to talk about disagreements and not to be afraid of talking about disagreements. And if you are afraid, you should talk about that part as well. So I wanted to summarize here and just talk about a few questions I want you to ask yourself in your relationship. Does my partnership encourage me to grow? Does my partnership does and I have the same vision of our future? Do we want to have the same kind of relationship? Can I be myself? Can I accept them for who they are? And the final question I want you to ask yourself about having a healthy relationship is, are you willing to put the time in to work through things as they come up? Because that is sort of the adaptability of life, is whether you can work on yourself and whether you're committed enough to work through some of the challenges of your partnership, because actually that is your own evolution. You are 50% at least of this connection, and when you work on it, you actually do the deeper work on yourself and figuring out how to grow your capacity and have some healthier, deeper, more satisfying connections. So I hope that you'll give me some feedback about the podcast if you have further questions, or if you'd like me to talk about a different angle. Thanks for listening.